Cool. Thanks everyone for battling it out. I'm battling because I was up at 4:15 this morning, so we get an interesting presentation from me. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Canterbury, and I'm supervised by Professor Sally Gore, Professor Brett Robertson from UC, and Dr. Olga Pantos, who's at ESR. And my study is funded by the AIM2 project. Cool. So we know a lot about plastics in the marine environment, as we've seen today. So we know that they're generally described as plastics smaller than 5 millimeters in size. They can be purposely produced to be small, or they can be fragments of larger pieces. But not much is known about microplastics in soil. So this makes up about 5% of all microplastics-related literature. And the reason why is because it's really, really difficult to deal with soil compared to water. You can just filter it. With soil, you have an organic solid, you have solids to try and remove solids from. So it gets really, really difficult here. So that just kind of got me thinking. So when I finished my master's in 2018, I just kind of wanted to continue. So the findings from that, I looked at wastewater treatment plants in Canterbury. So I looked at what was going in to the wastewater treatment plant and then what was going out. And when you think about wastewater treatment plants and microplastics, you're like, how do they get in there? So we use quite a lot of plastic products every day in the home, and we're not really aware of the small plastics. We're really aware of the larger plastics, so the ones that we put in our recycle bin. Or our landfill bin, but we don't think about the ones that we can't see, the ones that are going down the drain. So over time, all of these products will eventually fragment into smaller and smaller pieces, and these would get washed down the drain and to the wastewater treatment plant. So I looked at the water that was going into this wastewater treatment plant from our homes, which is the effluent, and then looked at what was going out to sea. As the effluent. So in Canterbury, we discharge effluent into the ocean. So I found that there was more plastics what was coming into the plant than what was going out. So that's interesting. So there's somewhere during this process where they're being diverted, and this is from the sludge. So we separate all of the solids. So it kind of makes sense that the microplastics are like concentrating into these solids. And in Canterbury, they're applied onto the Stockton mine for land remediation. So this got me thinking, so biosolids are applied onto land. What about other forms of solid waste which are applied onto land? So this got me thinking about compost, because we have curbside collection of compost. Where does that go? So I've thought about all the different bio-waste in New Zealand. So I thought about biosolids, which is the dried product of the sludge from the wastewater treatment plants. I thought about effluent. So I did the study where I looked at effluent, which is going out to sea. But then I was thinking there's like a huge shift into disposal of effluent onto land instead of into any water bodies. So I was just thinking about what happens to the microplastics in the effluent when it's on the soil, and also compost. I was just really interested in the compost as a waste stream. So all of these bio-wastes, they're applied onto land for different purposes. So quite often in terms of like forestry, where it doesn't really matter what you're putting on as long as you're putting nutrients on the land, she'll be right. Pasture, so it's quite water intensive to irrigate in terms of like dairy farms. So thinking about reuse of water instead of extracting of drinking water. Mine remediation, of course, so that's the Stockton mine on the west coast of the South Island. And also, and mainly the case of compost, but just being put onto like market gardens. So all these bio-waste going on there as well. So this gets really important when we think about, so that was kind of like a New Zealand example, but overseas, what do we do with our bio-waste? So 50% of all biosolids produced in Europe is applied to farmland. I'm not too sure what the definition of farmland is, but eventually it's going to go back into food producing crops. 10% of the world's food supply is irrigated with untreated wastewater. So this becomes really interesting when we think about climate change, water scarcity, increasing population. We're trying to feed our communities, and we're doing it with biowaste. So I love biowaste, and I believe that we should reuse it because it's a really valuable source of nutrients. So instead of like importing fertilizers, which may contain or may not, and the answer is yes, it does contain high levels of cadmium and polluting our soils, we could reuse biowaste as a source of nutrients. We're diverting it from landfill, and it's being beneficially reused instead of going to landfill or going out to the ocean. So this example here is of a curbside collection facility in New Zealand, and you can see that there's quite a lot of visible plastics in here. So if there's this much visible plastics in here, we're going to expect a lot of microplastics. And this particular facility, the curbside collection compost, goes to market gardens. So all of this is going to what food in New Zealand is grown. So this kind of like prompted my PhD research. So there's not really any data available in microplastics in soils in New Zealand at all. Mainly overseas studies have been focusing on biosolids or sludge. There's like no data on like horticultural or agricultural soil at all. Absolutely like no data about compost worldwide, and I have come to find out that it's because it's a really difficult medium to process. Compost is quite reactive. But like literally every review paper says that compost is a major source of microplastics to the terrestrial environment, but no one studies it. And of course, I have this interest in the reuse of biowaste as soil amendments, beneficial sources of nutrients, diverting from landfill, and thus in support of the circular economy. So I chose municipal biowaste. So these ones were based from wastewater treatment plants. So it's kind of like the waste that humans send to the wastewater treatment plants, not like dairy shed effluent. So I got samples of biosolids from all around New Zealand. And this was kind of like the final product before it was to be deposited on land. And I collected samples of the soil in pastures, which had actually been irrigated with like human effluent as well as treated. And I also had like a reference site to compare them. And then from the composts, I had 3 different composts. So one of them I call bulk compost. So imagine like a composting facility. It can either be large scale or like kind of cute community initiatives. And it had to have some degree of food scraps. So my second compost was bag compost. So it's just what you buy from like the garden centre. And interestingly, some of them didn't contain green waste at all. So there wasn't any food scraps, no like garden waste. It was all like chicken manure, bark, wood chip, that kind of thing, which people would put on their gardens. And I also looked at vermicasts. So this is like worm poo compost. So they had a really diverse range of feedstocks. So not just food scraps, but some of these companies also mix in biosolids, paper pulp from processing plants, septic tank waste. Yes, dairy processing waste and stuff. So from those 5 sample types, I collected 5 sites from around New Zealand with like 3 replicates. And so I processed them to try and remove the plastic out of these solid matrices, which was not easy. It took me like a year to develop a method because there's just none available online. And then once I was quite happy with separating out the plastics based on their density, so kind of exploiting the different densities of plastics, I picked them all out and looked at them under the microscope and then put them all under the FTIR. So that's just kind of like a fancy spectrometer where it shoots a laser through the particle and tells you what polymer type it is. So this is just kind of an example. So once I've like chemically digested my soils, it kind of separates out. So the plastics float at the top and then the soils kind of like sink. And I use like a really high density salt for this. So I use sodium iodide and it's about 1.8 grams per mil, whereas plastics generally, their densities top off at around like 1.4 grams per mil. So I'm kind of like trying to get as much as possible. So you can kind of see it's like quite visually contaminated with larger plastics. So this is not like under the microscope or anything. This is just using my phone camera. And that was from vermicasts. So again, that weren't per composting. So once I have a look at that under the microscope, I pick them all out. And this is kind of some of the plastics that I got. So this is from a biosolid sample. And this is not like the whole 30 grams of sample. It's just kind of like half of it. But you can see that we've got like quite diverse sizes, shapes, colours, and varying amounts as well. So from here, this is when I pick them all out with tweezers and then put them under the IR to determine if they're plastic and what polymer type they are. And I kind of joke that I'm probably like a qualified brain surgeon because I'm like looking under the microscope with my tweezers. So if this whole gig doesn't work out. So I categorize all of my plastics by its morphotype. So kind of like what Rufino was talking about, how if it's a fragment, if it's like a regular shaped particle, if it's a fiber like from our clothes, if it's a film, so like a really thin film, or a bead. So New Zealand banned the sale of microbead containing products in 2018, but I'm still finding microbeads today, which is interesting. I also find quite a lot of glitter. Glitter just comes up all the time. So all of this is polyester as well. So not just in like my biosolids, but also in my compost. So it kind of raises a few questions of how did plastic get into compost? As well as kitchen sponge bits. I get so many kitchen sponge fragments come through, and this is all polyurethane. So of course, when you like scrub it over time, it just kind of like fragments all these little bits of sponge, so they just end up in the compost or biosolids is where I've been finding them. Lots of like really pretty colors. So these are, I've asked so many people what they think it is, but no one knows. It's kind of like, it's printed in like this, there was a word for it, but I can't remember. But it's like really, really small fragments. They're quite brittle. They're like acrylic kind of fragments. Yeah, it's just kind of fun to see, but this is quite a recurring sample type, especially in some vermicast samples, especially the ones I've been processing like this week. There's heaps of them in there. Yeah. No. If you were to pick it up with two tweezers, it would like snap. It's really brittle, super brittle, so I've got no idea. And just like lots of cute little shapes and stuff. So it's like super small. So if you think about it, you can't see this with your eyes. You find it under the microscope and it's kind of weird. But yeah, have the best time. Yeah, listen to my podcast and have a great time. So this is kind of like looking at the abundance of plastic in each of these different sample types. So this is the total. So like the total average of the 5 sites. So the average of the 5 sites for each sample type. So it's not really and I've scaled it to per gram. So instead of having it to like 30 grams, I've gone down to per gram. So it's not really a surprise that biosolids are the most contaminated. We'll probably guess that. And then next would be my bulk compost, are the ones that had some degree of food scraps. Next is the vermicast. I do have to mention I've got one more vermicast sample to process. And it's just taking me so long because it's like by far the most contaminated sample I've ever had. So I'm expecting this to go up a bit, as well as bad compost. I've got one more sample to process, so it might go up or down, the averages. Yeah, so we're finding there's quite a lot of plastics in these bio-waste. And if we compare it to the effluent irrigated onto land, so that's the first wee little graph here, we can see that there's not really too much plastics in here. So this is because I sampled the soil. So it brings up a few questions of like, where did the plastics go once they got into the soil? So this again is the same thing. The colours represent different morphotypes, so what shape is most common. So across all of the sample types, they're following the same trend, which is like really weird because they have different treatment types and different feedstocks. So we're finding fragments is the most abundant throughout all of them. They kind of change in between like treatment plant or like site, but just overall, this is the overall trend that fragments dominate, followed by thin films and then fibers. And then there's a few microbeads in every sample type apart from bulk compost. Yeah, so it's really weird that you get microbeads in bagged compost. I thought that was real tricky, but and then this is the same kind of thing with polymer types. So this is again when I shot the laser through each particle to tell us what type of plastic it was. And we're finding the most abundant polymer types are polypropylene and polyethylene, followed by acrylic, which is really the opposite to my wastewater samples where polyester was dominating. So yeah, not too sure about that. So from my rough estimates, my input to soil, we would be inputting about nearly 3,000 particles per kg of biosolids, nearly 2,000 particles per kg of bulk compost, so the one with food scraps in it, around 700 particles per kg of bagged compost, and around 1,600 particles per kg of vermicasts. So all of that's going into these productive soils. So my findings are there's common themes, so like common morphotype proportions and common polymer type proportions being conserved across these different sample types, which is just really interesting considering, again, it's different treatment types, different feedstocks. I also did find PLA present in my bulk compost sample, so that also raises like a lot of questions about the suitability of PLA being marketed as packaging. So a lot of consumers, I'm assuming, are just getting confused and just putting it in the compost bin. So even after a full composting cycle, PLA is still present, which is pretty interesting. So yes, we are diverting nutrients, carbon, nitrogen from landfill, but we're also introducing a whole heap of microplastic contamination into these productive soils. So that's also something to think about. And with those, we'll have site-specific implications. So if biosolids are going to be applied for like land remediation or like forestry, there'll be implications for that. Whereas with like compost, it might go to like market gardens. So we're introducing those plastics into like directly our food, which is grown in the soil. And so just the biggest question is, where do these plastics go once the amendment is applied? So the plastic does end up into the soil. We all know it's not going to go away. It's not going to break down because it's like covered in soil, and it's going to stop it from degrading, going through any of these oxidation processes. So apart from that, plastics can also harbour organic and inorganic contaminants. So that's kind of like your bulky PFAS and like your pharmaceuticals, as well as your heavy metals. So like your lead, your cadmium, your arsenic. They're going to just kind of be hanging out on the plastic. They're not going to like be speciated, transformed, or degraded because they're just being sheltered by the plastic, and that gives them availability to then perhaps desorb from the plastic and then be sucked up into sensitive biological systems, which is super scary. And some of the literature that's come out is that plastics can negatively affect the structure and community abundance of like microbes and fungi. So that's kind of like your basis of your soil health. So, sorry, Hannah. So if it's like, if your soil's not behaving, nothing else is going to behave. Microplastics have shown to increase mortality of earthworms, negatively cause like lesions on like the gastrointestinal tract of like snails, reduce their growth, their feeding and their reproduction, so everything they need to survive. And in the case of plants, microplastics can affect their growth. So the above and the below ground biomass is reduced, their height is reduced germination, reduced time to flowering. They can excrete oxidative stress biomarkers in like higher concentrations. So they're being stressed by plastic in the soil. So if the plants are being stressed by plastics in the soil, and if the soil microorganisms are just completely out of whack, then we're actually really creating quite a toxic environment for what we're trying to grow our food in. So this just brings it back to the slide. If we're looking at reusing these biowastes, which are just so nutritionally like nutrient dense, and it's just a waste to put them in landfill, we're also introducing it into our food source. So again, 50% of all biosolids produced in Europe is applied to farmland, and 10% of the world's food supply is irrigated with untreated wastewater. So not just microplastics, but what other contaminants are in these mediums as well. So what do we need to do? Turn off the tap. and just stop. We really want to be reusing these biowastes, and I'm kind of afraid that people are going to say they're too contaminated, get rid of them, send them to landfill, but I just really want to stop all of these plastics going into the biowaste along with the other contaminants as well, so that way we can have that circular economy. Yeah, so thanks to my supervisors and the AIM2 project as well for supporting me. Thanks.
Thank you. Great.
Yes.
Do you have any practices or as I told you, this is the research needs to be published tomorrow.
I'm sorry.
I have two questions. How have the compost sites reacted to your findings? What have you shared them with you? I know that we don't know who they are.
Yeah, oh yeah.
What's the reaction been like to the information of this site?
Yeah.
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 Second question was, there's very many contaminated land discussion around decontaminating these types of site of microplastics. But maybe no one really even knows the research.
Yeah. Yeah.
Charcoal stuff that PFAS they're talking about.
Yeah. Or like phytoremediation. Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. So Kim's first question was, how have the compost sites reacted? They haven't reacted because I haven't told them yet. But like, yeah, so all of the sites are like confidential, but as a promise for participating, I'm not disclosing where they are because obviously it's a commercial product, but also they'll get a copy of the results. I've been holding off on that because I just wanted to get my full data set, and we're kind of not sure how to navigate this because they had to sign an agreement to say that they would only share the results internally. So we're worried that they'll send that they would use the results as like a product endorsement. So we're not really too sure how to navigate it yet. My supervisors were kind of saying that we should publish it first and then give it to them. And then we'll give them results of the other sites, but we won't say who the other sites are. We'll say this is your site. So we haven't really talked to them yet. I've talked to a few of them just in passing, saying like, oh, hey, your site was the least contaminated. And from what I heard, I hear that they were pretty happy with that. And some of the ones who were the most contaminated, they were not super pleased, but they don't really understand what it means. So when I give the results to them, it'll be like in a report that they can digest, meaning what it means compared to where we're sitting in New Zealand compared to overseas as well. So it's a work in progress. I've just been so busy because I've been doing like a plant greenhouse study. So I've been like mixing plastic into soil and like growing plants. So like environmental nightmare I am. So I've been like trying to do that. So once I've like wrapped up my plant study, then I'll wrap up my bio waste and then let these know, people know, and publish it just for you, Kim. And then the other question was about trying to remediate plastics which are in the soil. So what can we do about removing them from soil? At this stage, I don't think that there's anything that can be done because once it's kind of tilled into the soil, once it's in there, you can't really get them out. And I know that you hear news every day about some new sort of plastic degrading organism which excretes a magical enzyme to degrade the plastics. But then what are you going to do? Are you just going to shove heaps of this enzyme into the soil and till it out? So I don't have any answers. I just think, unfortunately, when it's in the soil, it's just blocked from like light and a lot of things that might help it to degrade in a shorter amount of time, which is still a couple hundred years. So I just don't think there's any options for us at the moment when it's in the soil, unfortunately. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, Steve.
It's really great research, and I'm just sort of already thinking, yeah, so really, it's helping the process. But what I'm just understanding from the different types of products that you set out is that it seems biosolids probably there's a lot of inadvertent microplastic through coming through municipal waste and people using their products. Whereas compost and the vermiculture, that you could probably class more sort of deliberate use of materials or inputs.
Yeah.
And so there are possibly more direct proposals that can be placed on there. So that you maintain that, you know, sort of bio-waste. But there's potential regulations that can be more effective. Potential price. So there are some fair, I mean, there's politics, right? So you know what comes before. But the levers are simply over those.
I get what you mean. Cool. So Steph asked, when it comes to like biosolids contamination, it seems like it's just stuff that we're just living our lives. We're not deliberately tipping glitter down the drain. It just kind of happens from fragmentation. So washing of our clothes, that kind of thing, wiping off our makeup. If you've got nail polish on, it just kind of like chips over time. So that kind of thing is quite hard to control, to regulate. You can't control what people put down the drain, whereas you can control what people put down the compost bin. So Steph was saying that perhaps compost is probably the best thing we can try and regulate at this point. Maybe greater education and other things just to stop plastic going in there. So it almost seems like deliberate that people are putting plastic in there just because they're confused. So I agree. I feel like this is one thing that we can control as well and work on. Yeah, thank you. Lauren or Hannah? Hannah.
My question's on so I was going to ask a great question in observation. And I was going to say, obviously there's this growing drive now to get back some landfill. We've got to do it as quick as possible. And it's all about scale. The bigger, the better. Blah, blah, blah. In your study, you looked at both community composts and the bigger ones, and maybe you can't comment to this.
I can comment on that.
But like the theory goes with the smaller scale things. The theory goes that the more localized you are, then easier it is to control the inputs, and also the easier it is to communicate back to your customers as opposed to big curbside system like plant for the whole city. Does that consist with your
You'd hope so. So Hannah just asked if we looked at like our compost sites, and so I had like large scale facilities compared to like heavy small scale community. Perhaps at the larger facilities, they don't care, they don't regulate, there might be higher concentration in there compared to the small like decentralized systems which might actively try and remove plastic. So one of them was awesome, the small kind of community compost, so good, nothing in there, super happy with them. One of the other small ones was the most contaminated, but they're a school compost, and it's kind of interesting because they're a lovely school. They feed their kids as well, so all of the food from the kitchen goes into the compost, but they also get paid to take food scraps from supermarkets. So I feel like, so they get paid quite a lot of money per tonne, and they're going to like transform into like a large scale composting on their field. So unfortunately they were the most contaminated, but I also found quite a lot of glitter, so I'm just wondering if there's kids running around with like glitter and stuff. But yeah, so it's kind of hard. You kind of have to control the feed stocks, I suppose. But yeah.
So in terms of it almost seems like that school one could be a bit of an outlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
That use the word community, it's unclear if they are service they are paid or if it's voluntary. So when you're saying decentralized, it's still a commercial.
Oh, I don't know that question. I don't know. I'm not sure. Just asking, like, is the smaller compost facility, are they voluntary or are they paid? I believe they're paid. Yes, they'll be paid. Yeah. No, they're paid.
It has policy implications.
Yes.
Whether you can put things in a pure
no. Yeah.
Big scale, small scale.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
High quality stuff.
Yes. Yeah. No, it's cool. It was actually incredibly hard to find compost sites. It was when I struggled with the most. Like biosolids, they're like, we don't care, take as many biosolids as you like. But with compost, I think it's quite sensitive because if they are sold to like market gardens and that kind of thing, they were really worried, even though I said that your confidentiality would be like assured. But yeah, so I found it really hard to get composting sites. So in the end, I just kind of had to deal with what I had. I would have loved to just get like 5 large-scale communities and like also 5 like small large-scale composting facilities versus 5 small kind of things, but just didn't work out in the end. But yeah, just like a small look at what's happening in New Zealand. And, yeah, cool. Sorry, Laura, if I still have time.
Yeah, thank you. It's great for I'm curious to know if you find out about this colorful particle that have this.
Yeah, I have no idea. Olga was gonna like put it on Twitter, so if anyone's still on Twitter, can you like share Olga's post? Because I don't have a Twitter or anything. Because I presented this at like the Micro 2022 conference at the start of the month, and these are supposed to be like the actual microplastics experts, and they had like no idea, and I was like, damn, I've got no idea. So I was thinking maybe to talk to like the evil side, like the caustics or something, to see, but I don't know. Yeah.
So my question, right? Well, the two first is what's your detection side?
Yeah.
And the second is, do you or have you already good thing to first to compare what would be the input of microplastics, say a few liters of compost onto your soil versus like atmosphere?
Yeah, cool. So the first question was, what was my detection limit? So this just means what size microplastics did I include and what could I go down to? So obviously smaller is kind of more interesting because it's going to be the most bioavailable, the ones that are going to cause the most harm to organisms. So because I was picking them out with tweezers, I had to work to my physical working limit to what I could see under the microscope. So I can only pick up so small. The smallest I could pick up was 20 micrometers, which is tiny. But I found that FTIR kind of struggled at analysing the particles under 30 microns. So I do have a few confirmed polymers for like 20, but otherwise it kind of struggles, even though the IR's detection limit is supposed to be 7 microns. No. So unfortunately not very small at the moment. But when we're talking about soils, it's really hard to do really small. Like ramen becomes unavailable because your filters are so dirty, that kind of thing. And then the other question was, what's the comparison towards like a ton of like how much microplastics are in like a ton of biowaste compared to like atmospheric deposition? I'm not sure about that one. That will be a really interesting one to look at. I was going to do kind of like some modelling to see like how much microplastics would we be adding in like nutrient requirements, depending on like how much like carbon and nitrogen is required of like market gardens or like forestry, that kind of thing. So I'll hopefully do some modelling of that. And compared with atmospheric deposition, I'm not too sure much about that, but that would be really cool to include as well, because if you think about it, there's just so many plastics floating around in the room right now. So yeah, it'd be interesting. Thank you.